I'm a 28-year-old guy, and my wife Lisa is 27. A few months ago, we finally became parents after years of struggling with infertility. Our baby girl, Ava, was everything we had ever hoped for, and her arrival felt like a miracle. We had spent years trying, facing disappointment after disappointment, until one day everything changed. Seeing her for the first time, holding her tiny hands, we knew we would do anything to protect her. At first, my parents seemed just as thrilled as we were. They were the kind of people who always had to be in control of everything. Wealthy, used to getting their way, and believing their opinions mattered more than anyone else's. But for the first few weeks, they played the role of doting grandparents perfectly. They visited often, bringing expensive gifts and talking about all the things they'd do with Ava when she was older. It was overwhelming, but I figured they were just excited. Then, about a month after Ava was born, my parents invited us over for dinner. It wasn't unusual. My mom loved hosting, and she had been hinting that she wanted a proper sit-down meal to celebrate Ava's arrival. So we went. Lisa was still exhausted from the sleepless nights, but we figured a meal with family couldn't hurt. Dinner started off normal. My mom had gone all out, making a fancy meal, and my dad poured himself a glass of expensive wine, acting like nothing in the world could bother him. We talked about Ava, about how Lisa and I were adjusting to being new parents, and then, just as dessert was served, my dad leaned forward and casually dropped a bombshell. They wanted custody of Ava. At first, I thought I had misheard. Lisa froze beside me, gripping her fork so tightly her knuckles turned white. My mom smiled like she had just offered us a vacation instead of suggesting we hand over our child. My dad, as calm as ever, started explaining their reasoning as if they were doing us a favor. According to them, Lisa and I were too young, too financially unstable, and too inexperienced to raise Ava properly. They, on the other hand, had the money, the time, and the resources to give Ava the best life possible. My mom even mentioned how raising another child would give her purpose now that she and my dad were nearing retirement. They made it sound so rational, so logical, like we should be thanking them instead of staring at them in absolute horror. Then they pulled out the real incentive. Money, a significant amount, enough to buy a house, pay off debts, or set us up for years. They said it so casually, like they were negotiating a business deal rather than talking about taking our child away from us. Lisa snapped first. She pushed her chair back, nearly knocking it over, and demanded to know if they had lost their minds. The idea that they thought we would sell our own child, because that's exactly what it was beyond insulting. I expected them to backtrack, to claim it was a joke, but they didn't. They just kept pushing, acting like we were being emotional and unreasonable. I told them no, absolutely not. That should have been the end of it. But a few days later, I got an envelope in the mail. Inside were preliminary custody transfer documents, a draft prepared by their lawyer. It wasn't legally binding yet, but the fact that they had gone this far without even consulting us was horrifying. They even had a lawyer involved. I saw red. I called them, barely able to get the words out, but my mom just sighed, saying she understood we were upset, but we needed to think about Ava's future, as if we weren't already doing that, as if handing her over to them was the only way she could have a good life. That was the final straw. I told them they had crossed a line they could never come back from. Lisa and I agreed. We were done. We cut contact, blocked them, and made it clear they were not welcome in our lives. But it didn't stop there. Some relatives took their side, calling us ungrateful, saying we should have at least considered their offer. Others were just as horrified as we were, unable to believe my parents had even suggested such a thing. The whole family was split, and suddenly, we weren't just dealing with my parents, we were dealing with everyone who had an opinion about what we should do. Then the guilt tripping started. My mom left crying voicemails, saying she only wanted the best for Ava, that we were being cruel by keeping her away, that she had never expected us to react this way. My dad, always the more composed one, sent an email saying he still hoped we would come to our senses. Lisa wasn't taking any chances. She insisted we talk to a lawyer, just to be safe. I thought she was overreacting, but after seeing how far my parents were willing to go, I realized she had a point. We needed to be prepared for whatever they might try next. And then just when we thought we had finally gotten some peace, they showed up at our door. No warning. No call. Just standing there, acting like everything was fine. My mom had a bright smile, holding a stuffed animal in one hand like she was just another grandmother dropping by for a visit. My dad was right behind her, calm as ever, hands in his pockets like this was just a normal family gathering. They asked to see Ava, said they were worried about her, that we were being unfair. They wanted to talk. I didn't even let them finish. I slammed the door in their faces. That's when I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Update 1. Lisa and I went completely no contact with my parents after they showed up at our house, unannounced. No calls, no messages, nothing. We blocked them on everything and made it clear we wanted nothing to do with them. For the first time in weeks, our home felt peaceful. That peace didn't last long. The family backlash hit almost immediately. My parents wasted no time in reaching out to extended relatives, twisting the story to make themselves look like the victims. They claimed they were just concerned grandparents being unfairly kept from their grandchild. My aunt called me the next day, telling me I was being too harsh, that my parents only wanted to help. My uncle sent a long-winded text about how I should reconsider because family is everything. Then the family group chat exploded. Some relatives took my side, saying my parents had crossed the line with their custody offer. Others sided with my parents, saying I was being too emotional and should at least talk to them. My mom played up the heartbreak angle, posting a dramatic message about how she never thought her own son would be so cruel as to take away the one thing she's always wanted. She made it sound like I had ripped Ava from her arms instead of shutting down her ridiculous offer to take custody. And then my dad upped the bribe. An email came through a few days later. The original offer of a lump sum was still there, but now they were also promising a massive trust fund, not just for Ava but for Lisa and me too. They made it sound like a golden opportunity. Think about Ava's future, the email said. This isn't about control, it's about giving her the best possible life. Lisa deleted the email before I could even finish reading it. Then came the letter. My mom, realizing that money wasn't going to work, switched to pure emotional manipulation. It arrived in the mail, written in perfect cursive on thick, expensive stationery. She wrote about how she had always dreamed of raising another child in her golden years, about how she had envisioned spoiling her last grandchild with everything money could buy. She even blamed me, saying I had crushed that dream and that one day Ava would resent me for keeping her away from the people who loved her the most. Lisa didn't even bother reading the whole thing. She ripped it up and threw it in the trash. That's when we knew we needed legal advice. We met with a lawyer, and he didn't sugarcoat things. He warned us that my parents might attempt to file for grandparents' rights if they felt desperate enough. Depending on the state, they could try to argue for visitation, or even attempt to claim we were unfit parents. It was a long shot, but not impossible. Lisa, already exhausted from dealing with them, started to panic. A few days later, my sister called me. She was the only one in my family who had kept her distance, and at first I thought she was calling to offer support. Instead, she dropped a bombshell. My parents had been talking to CPS behind our backs. She didn't know exactly what they said, but from what she overheard, they were subtly trying to paint Lisa and me as irresponsible parents. They weren't outright making accusations, but they were planting seeds, asking hypothetical questions, hinting at concerns about our ability to provide a stable home. That was it. Lisa was done. We installed security cameras the same day, every entrance, every window, covered. We warned our daycare that under no circumstances were our parents allowed to pick up Ava. They didn't have any legal claim over her, but we didn't want to take any risks. Lisa didn't sleep much that night, and neither did I. The next morning I called my parents. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just told them to stop. They played dumb, acted like they had no idea what I was talking about. My mom gasped in fake shock at the mention of CPS, pretending to be insulted that I would accuse them of something like that. My dad, ever the businessman, just calmly said that concerned grandparents have every right to ask questions. I hung up. That night, I wrote about everything on Reddit. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a few people to validate that I wasn't crazy. Instead, the post blew up. Thousands of people chimed in, horrified at what my parents had done. People shared legal advice, personal experiences, and ways to protect our family from further interference. Seeing so many strangers completely on our side made Lisa feel safer, even if the situation hadn't changed yet. The lawyer recommended a restraining order. He said it was the only way to ensure my parents stayed away for good. At first I hesitated, thinking maybe this was all just bluster. But after everything they had already done, I realized waiting any longer was a risk we couldn't afford. And then my brother called. I should have ignored it, but I picked up. He wasn't calling to check on us. He wasn't calling to say he understood. He was calling to tell me I was being irrational. He repeated the same nonsense my parents had said, that they were just thinking about Ava's best interests, that I was letting Lisa poison me against them, that I was turning a simple misunderstanding into a war. That was all I needed to hear. I made a final decision right then and there. Anyone who defended my parents was cut off too. I was done playing nice. Update 2. A few days after I cut off my brother and made it clear that anyone defending my parents was dead to me, Lisa got an unexpected call. It was from an unknown number, and against her better judgment, she picked up. It was my mother. She didn't try to argue or beg, at least not right away. She spoke in a soft, almost pleading tone, acting like she just wanted to talk. She said she was heartbroken, that she missed Lisa and Ava, and that she didn't want things to be like this. Then, the real purpose of the call slipped out. She wanted Lisa to reconsider their offer. Lisa hung up immediately. Within minutes her phone started blowing up with messages. My mother switched tactics fast, first guilt-tripping, then playing the victim, and finally thinly veiled threats. If Lisa really cared about Ava's future, she'd at least meet with them. My father even chimed in, making it sound like they had some serious concerns about our ability to parent. Lisa blocked their numbers and told me everything. That same night, I called our lawyer again. He told us to document everything. Every call, every text, every attempt they made to manipulate us. He warned us that if they were still pushing this hard, they weren't going to back down anytime soon. And then, 2 days later, CPS showed up at our door. A woman stood outside with a clipboard. looking almost apologetic. She introduced herself as a child protective services worker and told us she was there due to an anonymous complaint about unsafe living conditions. Lisa went pale. We let her in. She walked around inspecting everything: Ava's nursery, the kitchen, the living room. She asked a few questions, checked Ava's crib, and within minutes it was clear she saw no issue. The house was clean, the baby was happy and well cared for, and Lisa and I weren't doing anything remotely neglectful. By the end of the visit, she confirmed that the case would likely be closed immediately. There was nothing to investigate. Before leaving, she told us that in cases like this it's usually someone close to the family making false reports. She couldn't confirm who called, but we didn't need confirmation. We already knew. My parents had actually called CPS on us. That was the moment everything changed. I didn't care what it took. My parents were done. No more second chances. No more hesitation. That weekend, the extended family organized a meeting at my aunt's house, supposedly to clear the air. Lisa didn't want to go, but I needed to make one thing clear. My parents were not going to win. The moment I walked in, I could tell it was a trap. A few relatives sat awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. Others, like my aunt and uncle, looked like they were ready to lecture me. My mother sat in the middle of the room with a carefully sad expression, and my father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed like he was already in control of the conversation. I barely got 2 words out before the attack started. My uncle accused me of ripping the family apart over a misunderstanding. My aunt said I needed to think about Ava instead of my personal issues with my parents. My mother even started fake crying, saying she couldn't believe I would ruin their reputations by telling people they called CPS. That's when my sister stood up. Up until now, she had kept her mouth shut, not picking sides, but this time she spoke up, and what she said changed everything. She told the entire room the real reason my parents were pushing so hard to take Ava. It wasn't about concern. It wasn't about love. It was about control. My parents had told her, in their own words, that they saw Ava as their second chance. They believed they had failed as parents with me and my siblings, and that this was their opportunity to raise a child the right way. The room went dead silent. Even the relatives who had been defending them looked stunned. My father tried to brush it off, but my sister kept going. She told everyone how they had bragged about their plan, how they had talked about shaping Ava into the child they wished they had raised. They didn't want a grandchild. They wanted a do-over. My mother stormed out of the room. My father followed. By the time I got home, I had blocked them on everything. Lisa and I filed a cease and desist the next morning. Our lawyer drafted it, making it clear that any further attempts to contact us, harass us, or interfere with Ava's life would result in legal action. That's when my mother went nuclear. She went straight to Facebook, posting a dramatic public rant about how Lisa had stolen me from my family, how she had turned me against them, and how she was forbidding me from letting Ava have a relationship with her real family. Then the harassment started. Distant relatives, some of whom I hadn't spoken to in years, began sending messages, some begging me to reconsider, others outright insulting me. My mother knew what she was doing. She knew that if she spun the story the right way, certain relatives would jump to her defense without asking questions. Then my lawyer called with even worse news. My parents had been consulting with family court attorneys. They were trying to figure out if they had a case to file for grandparents' rights. According to my lawyer, if they could prove that they had a pre-existing bond with Ava, or if they could convince a judge that Lisa and I were unfit, they might actually have grounds to push for visitation. Or worse. I wasn't waiting around to see what they would try next. Lisa and I moved. We didn't tell anyone, except a handful of trusted friends. New house, new neighborhood, new security measures. My parents had proven that there was no line they wouldn't cross. Even with everything we had done, I feared my parents wouldn't stop. But after the legal defeat, they should have realized they had no case, yet they were still looking for ways to manipulate the system. Not yet. Update 3. A few weeks after Lisa and I moved, things were finally starting to feel normal again. The security cameras were up, we had a new address that only a handful of trusted people knew, and for the first time in months we thought we were finally done dealing with my parents' insanity. Then, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was a notice from the court. My parents had officially filed a petition to request grandparents' rights, despite the fact that they had barely spent any time with Ava. Our lawyer assured us their case was extremely weak, but the fact that the court was willing to review it was infuriating. Lisa stood frozen, gripping the paper so tightly her hands shook. The legal jargon was dense, but the message was clear. They were suing us for visitation, and if they could prove their case, they might even get partial custody. We took the notice straight to our lawyer. That's when we learned just how much trouble we were in. In our state, grandparents can petition for visitation rights if they can prove they have an existing relationship with the child, or if they can argue that denying them access would emotionally harm the child. Even worse, in rare cases, if they convince the court that the parents are unfit, they could actually push for custody. Our lawyer assured us that their case was weak. My parents had never been involved in Ava's life, and we had documented proof that they had only ever tried to take her away, not build a bond. But the fact that they had gone this far meant one thing. They weren't going to stop. That same night, the family group chat exploded again. Some relatives blamed me for pushing my parents to this. My uncle posted a long-winded rant about how I had forced their hand and that I should have just let them be grandparents. Others finally saw my parents for what they really were. My cousin messaged me privately, saying she couldn't believe they were trying to take Ava through the court system. And then my mother started her smear campaign. Within hours, Facebook posts appeared claiming that Lisa was suffering from severe postpartum depression and was neglecting Ava. She made it sound like she was worried for her grandchild's safety, dropping vague statements about how she had tried to help but had been shut out. Messages from distant relatives started pouring in. Some were concerned, asking if everything was okay. Others flat out accused us of hurting Ava. My mother knew what she was doing, planting just enough doubt so that people would start questioning us. That was Lisa's breaking point. She shut off her phone and locked herself in the bedroom. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale. It took nearly an hour for her to calm down. She was terrified. What if the court actually believed them? What if they took Ava? I called our lawyer again. We had to fight back. The next day, we started gathering evidence. Every text, every email, every attempt my parents had made to manipulate us. Our lawyer put together a timeline, proving they had no meaningful relationship with Ava before they tried to take her. Then my sister called. She had made her decision. She was going to testify against them. She was done protecting them. She told our lawyer everything, how my parents had never cared about Ava, how they saw her as a do-over child, and how they had been planning to take her long before they even made us the first offer. That testimony was going to be our trump card. The first court hearing arrived sooner than expected. Lisa and I sat in the courtroom, watching as my parents took the stand. My mother cried on cue, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she talked about how we had ripped her grandchild away. My father sat stone-faced, portraying himself as a rational, concerned grandparent. Then it was our turn. Our lawyer laid everything out. The CPS report proving the complaint was false, the cease and desist order they had ignored, and the proof that my parents had never been involved in Ava's life. Then my sister took the stand, confirming everything. When the judge finally spoke, my mother looked like she had won. Then the ruling came down. The judge denied their request for immediate visitation. He stated that before my parents could argue for rights, they had to prove they had an established relationship with Ava. Since they had no proof, their case was severely weakened. Then came the next blow, a temporary restraining order. The judge agreed that their actions showed a pattern of harassment and issued a temporary no-contact order against them. My mother collapsed into my father's arms, sobbing like someone had died. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't say a word. For the first time since this all started, I thought it was finally over. I was wrong. A few days later, my dad called from a private number. He made a simple offer. They would drop the case if we agreed to supervised visits. I didn't even hesitate. No deal. And that's when they pulled their next move. 2 days later, we received another legal notice. My parents had filed a new motion, this time claiming Lisa and I were emotionally abusive, citing concerns they had allegedly raised with CPS. Our lawyer believed they were trying to fabricate a new issue since CPS had already found no evidence of neglect. This fight wasn't over, not even close. Update 4. The court officially ordered Lisa and me to undergo psychological evaluations. Our lawyer wasn't surprised. He said this was a common tactic in custody battles, where one side had no real case. My parents were trying to paint us as unstable in hopes that the court would see them as the safer option for Ava. The good news, these evaluations wouldn't be based on random accusations. They would be conducted by licensed professionals, and my parents couldn't control the results. Lisa wasn't convinced. She was terrified that no matter what we said or did, my parents would twist it to fit their narrative. It didn't help that she was already exhausted from months of stress, legal battles, and online harassment. And then, the betrayal happened. I got a message from an old friend, someone I had grown up with and considered family. He told me he needed to talk. In person. That was the first red flag. We met at a coffee shop, and I knew something was off the second I saw him. He looked nervous, like he didn't want to be there. And then, he dropped the bombshell. My parents had been using him to get information about us. It started small, innocent-sounding questions about how we were adjusting to parenthood. But then, they started pressuring him. They wanted details about Lisa, about Ava, about whether we were struggling. They were looking for anything they could use to convince the court we weren't fit parents. And he gave it to them. He didn't think it was a big deal at first, until he realized they were twisting his words in legal documents. I asked him if he had told them anything damaging. He hesitated before admitting that he had mentioned Lisa's stress and anxiety. That's when I knew he was done. I told him we were no longer friends. There was no coming back from this. When I told Lisa, she shut down completely. For weeks she had been paranoid that my parents were still finding ways to get information on us, and now she was right. If one person had betrayed us, who else had? Were they talking to neighbors, work colleagues, people at daycare? Then my mother had another meltdown. She posted an open letter on Facebook, claiming that I was brainwashed by Lisa and that I was being manipulated into shutting out my real family. She wrote about how she had no choice but to go to court because Lisa had made it impossible for her to be a grandmother. This time, the reaction was different. Some extended relatives who had previously defended her started turning against her. A few messaged me privately, apologizing for ever believing her lies. One relative even screenshotted messages from my mother admitting that she planned to take full custody of Ava if she won the case. Then my sister delivered the final blow. She recorded a conversation with my parents. In it, my father admitted that they saw Ava as their second chance, and that this was never about being grandparents. It was about doing things right this time. He even laughed about how easy it would be to fix the damage Lisa and I had already done as parents. That recording changed everything. In court, our lawyer played the entire conversation. My parents' lawyer tried to object, but the judge allowed it. Everyone in that room heard my parents admitting that this wasn't about love. It was about control. When it ended, my mother started crying, my father went pale, and then the judge gave his ruling. The request for custody and visitation was denied. The judge called their behavior disturbing and said that they had clearly demonstrated that they didn't have Ava's best interests at heart. He permanently dismissed their case and kept the restraining order in place. My mother collapsed into her chair, sobbing like she had lost a family member. My father didn't say a word. They had lost, or at least, that's what I thought. 2 days later, I got an email from my father. He wanted a private meeting. One last talk, he said. I almost ignored it, but Lisa and I agreed that if it meant finally getting them out of our lives forever, it was worth hearing them out. We met at a neutral location, a lawyer's office, so there would be no surprises. My parents walked in looking defeated. My mother's eyes were red. My father's face was tight with anger. But then he spoke. He offered us $500,000 in a trust fund for Ava if we agreed to let them have unsupervised visits. They were literally trying to buy their way into our child's life. I laughed in their faces. Then I walked out. That was the last time I ever saw them. Update 5. The court battle was officially over. My parents had exhausted every legal avenue. Their lawsuit for grandparents' rights had been denied. Their attempts to paint Lisa and me as unfit parents had backfired, and the restraining order was made permanent. That should have been the end of it. But people like my parents never truly accept defeat. Lisa finally started therapy to work through the trauma of nearly losing our daughter to her own in-laws. The months of stress, paranoia, and betrayal had taken a toll on her, but for the first time in a long time she was able to breathe. As for the rest of the family, silence. The same relatives who once defended my parents now wanted nothing to do with them. Even my uncle, who had originally blamed me for pushing them to this, had gone quiet. No one wanted to associate with them after everything they had pulled. Then a handwritten letter arrived in the mail. I knew it was from my mother before I even opened it. At first glance it read like a pathetic plea for forgiveness. She wrote about how she never meant for things to go this far, how she missed us, how she couldn't believe I had chosen a restraining order over family. She begged me to at least consider letting her be in Ava's life. But then at the very bottom of the letter, she included a single chilling line. One way or another, I will always be in my granddaughter's life. It wasn't a direct threat, but it was enough. I took the letter straight to our lawyer. We were already considering moving again, just to completely sever any last ties, and this sealed it. Within a few weeks we finalized the paperwork for a new home in a different city. But just as we were preparing to leave, my lawyer uncovered something that sent Lisa into a panic. My parents had hired a private investigator. It wasn't a direct violation of the restraining order. Technically, they weren't approaching us themselves, but they had been paying someone to check in on us. That was borderline stalking. Our lawyer immediately filed a motion for a permanent protection order, which would legally bar them from any form of contact, direct or indirect. While waiting for the hearing, I received a call from my sister. She was done with them. She had tried, even after testifying against them, to salvage some sort of relationship. But after learning about the letter and the PI, she knew there was no coming back from this. She cut them off completely. Then something unexpected happened. My Reddit posts started blowing up. The updates I had been sharing, originally just to vent, had gone viral. Thousands of strangers were commenting, supporting us, sharing similar experiences. People were furious at what my parents had done. Even Lisa, who had never been one for social media, wrote a post about standing up to toxic family members. It took off almost immediately, with thousands of people rallying behind her. For the first time since this nightmare started, it felt like the world was on our side. Then a rumor reached me through a cousin. Apparently my parents were planning to move, but at the same time, they had been discreetly hiring a private investigator to find us. It didn't make sense. If they wanted to claim a bond with Ava, why would they need to track her down? I didn't know if it was true or if they were trying to make us feel safe before pulling something else. Either way, I wasn't taking chances. I went through with the final step. I legally changed my last name. No more ties. No more connections. My parents were officially nothing more than strangers. Update 6. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. For the first time in a long time, things were quiet. No texts. No emails. No court notices. No random family members trying to guilt trip me into making amends. It felt wrong. After everything my parents had pulled, the lawsuits, the fake CPS reports, the private investigator, there was no way they were just giving up. But weeks passed, then months, and nothing happened. Lisa and I wanted to believe it was over. Then my sister called. She had news. Our parents had moved. At first it sounded like a win. They had relocated to another state, far from us, cutting the last thread of their obsession with controlling Ava. But then my sister dropped the second bombshell. They had moved near my childhood best friend, the same one who had betrayed me. I reached out to him, not because I trusted him, but because I needed to know if they were planning something. His response: he didn't know they were moving there, but they had already reached out to him. They were asking questions, casual at first. How was he? How was the neighborhood? Had he heard anything about me? Then they got more direct. Did he know where we had moved? Did he know if Lisa was working? That's when Lisa and I knew this wasn't over. We were being hunted. Our lawyer confirmed it. The private investigators never stopped. My parents had just changed tactics. Instead of sending people to directly watch us, they were using third-party sources, friends, old neighbors, even distant relatives. They were gathering breadcrumbs, little details here and there that could eventually lead them to us. Then our lawyer gave us the worst news yet. Because my parents had moved states, they could theoretically file a new grandparents' rights case in their new location. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. We weren't paranoid. They were setting up for round two. And then, the most disturbing thing happened. A coworker pulled me aside at work one day. He had been at a coffee shop that morning and overheard an older couple having a conversation. They were talking about how they were hoping to reconnect with their grandchild soon. They spoke about how they hadn't seen her in so long but were looking for ways to get back in. It could have been anyone, but something about it felt off. I asked my coworker what they looked like. The woman, blonde, expensive jewelry, cried a lot. The man, calm, well-dressed, spoke with authority. It was them. They were still watching. Still plotting. Lisa had reached her breaking point. She had endured months of stress, manipulation, and legal threats. And now, knowing they were still trying to find us, she decided we needed to take every possible precaution to keep Ava safe. Our social media accounts, wiped. Our personal details, removed from public databases. We even checked our bank accounts to make sure they hadn't tried to access anything. Then, the next betrayal came. My aunt suddenly reached out. She wanted to visit Ava. She wanted to put the past behind us. It was obvious. Too obvious. She had barely spoken to us in years. She had sided with my parents during the lawsuit. She had made zero effort to reach out when we were fighting for custody. And now, out of nowhere, she was trying to reconnect. She was working with them. I sent one final warning. A cease and desist went straight to her door. And then, we took one last step. We hired a security consultant. He wiped our digital footprint, removed any trace of our new address, phone numbers, work locations. He set up firewalls against tracking software, changed our personal records, and made sure that no one, not even a private investigator, could trace us again. If my parents wanted to find us now, they would have to do it the old-fashioned way, face to face. And if they did, we were ready. Update 7. 1 year later and a massive twist. For the first time in years, life was peaceful. No legal threats. No unexpected letters. No fake CPS reports. No distant relatives popping up with concerns. Just silence. Lisa and I finally felt like we could breathe. Ava had just turned 1, and we celebrated in complete privacy. No forced family gatherings. No fake smiles. Just us, a few trusted loved ones, and a day filled with genuine happiness. Lisa even had a small cake smash photo shoot planned. Something she had always wanted to do. As a final step in severing ties, Lisa filed the paperwork to legally change Ava's last name. That was it. The last connection to my parents was gone. At least that's what I thought. Then, a distant cousin reached out. They weren't looking for drama. They just thought I should know. My parents were still talking about Ava, constantly, even after losing in court, even after being cut off from every family gathering, even after we had disappeared from their lives. It wasn't just casual conversation either. My mother had made Ava her new obsession. She had joined an estranged parent support group. There she painted herself as a tragic victim, a loving mother and grandmother cruelly cut off by her controlling daughter-in-law. She played the part perfectly, sharing edited versions of what happened. She left out the custody battle. She ignored the CPS report. She pretended she had never tried to buy her grandchild, and people believed her. She had strangers feeling sorry for her. Some even encouraged her to keep fighting for visitation. That's when our lawyer found something disturbing, an old, undelivered letter from my mother. It had been sitting in a file, never officially sent to us. Inside, she had threatened more legal action. She wrote about how she had options left and how we wouldn't win forever. But she never followed through. It was a bluff. Instead, she found another way to erase Ava from reality. I found out through a former family friend. My mother had started telling people that Lisa had a miscarriage. She had rewritten history, pretending Ava never even existed. At the same time, she had begun looking into private adoption agencies, telling others she was considering taking in a child who actually wanted her in their life. To her, it was easier to erase her granddaughter completely than to admit she had lost control. Lisa was furious. She had tolerated everything. The lies, the manipulation, the court battle, but this was the final line. She made one thing clear. If my mother ever contacted us again, she would sue her for harassment. We weren't going to take any chances. Lisa and I sold our house and moved to another state. A full reset. New city, new address, new life, somewhere they could never find us again. Before we left, Lisa did one last thing. She burned my mother's last letter. It was her way of closing that chapter for good. My sister followed soon after. She had already cut off my parents, but now, she took the final step. She moved away, changed her number, and disappeared from their lives completely. Then, the last attempt came. A mutual friend reached out with a message. "Your mother just wants to talk." I blocked them, and that was it. No more second chances. No more guilt. No more fear. Just freedom. Lisa started therapy again, not to survive, but to heal. And as I watched Ava take her first steps in our new home, I knew she would never know the chaos my parents brought into our lives. And that was the greatest victory of all. Update 8. Months had passed since we moved and cut off the last remaining ties to my parents. Life was finally peaceful. No court cases, no private investigators, no sudden appearances. Lisa was healing, Ava was thriving, and for the first time, we were actually living instead of just surviving. Then, a message popped up from a number I never expected to see again. My former best friend. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the best of me. The message was short. "You won't believe what your parents just did." I braced myself for another lawsuit, another manipulation attempt, but nothing could have prepared me for this. My mother had gone full insanity mode. She had posted a long, dramatic Facebook rant about how she was wrongfully cut off, and how Lisa had brainwashed me into keeping Ava from her. But this time, it wasn't just guilt tripping. She announced that she and my father were looking for a surrogate to have a replacement grandchild. Her words, not mine. They wanted a fresh start with a baby they could actually raise the right way. It didn't stop there. A week later, my mother posted again, this time announcing that they were looking to adopt. Apparently, since they had lost their first chance at raising the perfect grandchild, they now believed they deserved another shot. They had even submitted paperwork to an adoption agency, arguing that they were qualified parents who could provide a child with a stable and loving home. Except, they forgot something. The restraining order. Their story got attention online. People, some of whom had followed my Reddit updates, found the adoption agency's post about prospective parents. Comments started flooding in, exposing their history. People sent messages to the agency, linking articles about grandparents' rights lawsuits, CPS reports, and my mother's obsessive behavior. Within a week, the adoption application was denied. Not only that, but their names were flagged, preventing them from ever applying again. My mother snapped. She went back to Facebook, blaming me and Lisa for ruining her life. She wrote that she had done nothing wrong and that cruel and heartless people had stolen her chance at happiness. Then she turned on my father. She claimed he never supported her enough, and accused him of failing their family. Then, something I never saw coming happened. One of my mother's old friends reached out. She apologized for ever believing my mother's side of the story. Apparently, my mother had spent years portraying herself as a devoted mother and grandmother who was unfairly cast out of our lives. But after seeing her public meltdown, even her closest friends were starting to distance themselves. Then came the biggest surprise. My father contacted me. He claimed he was divorcing my mother because he couldn't handle her obsession anymore. Looking back, there had been signs. He had grown quieter during family gatherings, less involved in their escalating actions, but I had never expected him to finally break away. According to him, this was never what he wanted. He just went along with it because he thought it would blow over. Now that she had ruined their reputations, he wanted out, and of course he wanted to reconnect with me. I blocked him immediately. Lisa had spent years trapped in the nightmare my parents created. This time, she wanted to help others. She wrote an anonymous blog post detailing everything we had been through. It gained traction quickly. People, especially other parents, related to it. The messages she received weren't pity. They were solidarity. She wasn't alone. Then, one last attempt, a text from an unknown number. "Happy birthday to our sweet granddaughter. We love you." They didn't sign their names, but it was obvious. I immediately reported the number. That was the last straw for their remaining family members. Even their own siblings cut them off. They were completely alone. No friends, no family, no grandchild. Lisa turned to me one night, after we had put Ava to bed. She looked at me and said, "We're free now." And for the first time, I actually believed her. We packed our bags, took a long overdue vacation, and for the first time in years, we lived our lives without fear. Ava would never know the chaos my parents brought into our lives. And that was the greatest revenge of all.